Hello and welcome to Westwind, an audio podcast about cancer, technology in medicine, and policy issues. I'm host and medical oncologist Dr. Jack West from the City of Hope Comprehensive Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area. You can find Westwind material at BeaconMedIC, one word.com, at iTunes, or just about anywhere you get podcast content. I would just ask that you show your interest and support by subscribing, commenting, sharing by telling friends and colleagues in person and on social media, and rating it however you feel is appropriate. You can also share your ideas and opinions by emailing us at westwindpodcast@gmail.com. Today, my guest is Dr. Taofeek Owonikoko, MD, PhD, who's a professor and attending physician, medical director of the Phase 1 Clinical Trials Program, and the co-director of thoracic oncology in the Hematology and Oncology Department at Winship Cancer Institute, Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. Taofeek, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Dr. West, for having me.
Oh, it's Jack. Come on, we're friends here. So.
We'll make you formal to start with.
No. It's this is not the way we roll. So.
Oh, okay. All right. We'll roll California style.
Yeah. Well, come on. We've actually been friends for years.
Yeah, that's true. All right. Thanks so much, Jack. Happy to be on.
So I'd like to start by talking about the backgrounds of my colleagues before they became well known to many of us. And I think your background's really quite unique. Can we start out with some of your thoughts of your family and childhood, where you grew up and what that was like?
Yeah, so I grew up in Nigeria, which is on the west coast of the African continent, for those who may not easily locate that. It's sandwiched between Cameroon and Republic of Benin. So Nigeria is probably more famous than those other countries, but those are the geographical locators, if you may. And my childhood was spent in a small town called Iseyin in Oyo State, Nigeria, about 120 miles from Lagos, the former capital of the country, which is where I had my elementary school and my high school, after which I left for medical school in a different city about 80 miles away in the southern part of the country.
And growing up, did you have any idea that you wanted to be a physician? Were there physicians in your family or other people readily available to you that you saw as a model, or did that come later?
That's actually very interesting. Growing up, I actually did not think of going into the medical profession. I do not have any medical doctor as a role model in the family. If you ask me what I actually wanted to be, it was to be a pilot, because as a young child, my dad had a friend then who was a pilot and used to visit, and I would see him in his, white uniform, crisp, and say, "Oh, that looks good. I want to be something like that." Now, traditionally in Nigeria, kids don't pick their own profession for the most part, at least when I was growing up. Things have changed now. So typically, it's more of your parents and your older siblings may be suggesting to you, like, "You're good in this would be good for you." So for all of us, actually most of us then, my dad basically chose our profession for us. I come from a large family with 9 siblings, and it will be, ticking off everyone in terms of this is what you're going to do, this is what you're going to do. And for me, I think he had 2 things in mind. One is I either do medicine or that I will train as an Islamic cleric.
Those are different.
Exactly. They're different, but somewhere connected. Because if you think of medical, which is physical healing, and cleric, which is more spiritual healing. So that is probably that healing component to both of them.
Now, where did you fit in the birth order of you and your 9 siblings?
I'm the third.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did a lot of the resources go to the first few, or was it pretty equal opportunities for everybody, or what?
Growing up, I was fortunate that, I come from a stable middle-class family, I would say, in the context of Nigeria, fairly well-to-do. So in terms of allocating resources, that was actually not a problem. I think it was more of, my 2 older siblings. The first one went to law school. The second one did engineering, and actually had some sort of precocious development because I overtook the second sibling in high school. Because of the way the schooling system was, you had the choice of either going straight to high school, or you could do what you consider the equivalent of middle school here and then going to high school. So he went to middle school, which will make you lose a year when you go back to high school. So with that, I sort of overtook him. But he was the one that I would say of all of us, probably more self-conscious in terms of what he wanted to do. Like, this is what I'm going to do. You're not going to suggest to me. So it was suggested to do building technology. But then when he got to the university, he actually changed his course and decided to do chemical engineering. Whereas the rest of us just followed the prescription from home.
Well, you've had some curves along the way.
Sure.
You did your medical education in Nigeria. What was that like? Is it typical along the lines of the European model where you go from high school and it's not separate college, but it's a longer course and it's all medical?
Yeah, so the medical education then in Nigeria was patterned along the UK system, given the colonial history and relationship. So the educational system actually was patterned along the British system, where you go directly from high school to the university, you select your course of study. If you may, similar to people here going through combined pre-med med admission so that there is no break in between. So with that, the medical school is typically 6 years straight. The first 2 years is combination of liberal arts studies and science, and then the last 4 years will be hardcore medical school.
How did you find that education now that you can look from the perspective of having been educated on multiple continents and in many systems?
Yeah, I think every system has its own positives and challenges. The one unique aspect of the medical training in Nigeria is that we all started medical school at a very tender age. And at times, by the time you are even getting close to the end of your training, you're just maturing as a person. And then most of your maturation would happen during your residency training. So, in a way, for those who are emotionally mature, maybe precocious maturity in terms of emotional stability, it may not be much of a challenge. But there are, some of my colleagues in medical school who struggled. We had some of my colleagues who ended up in psychiatric hospital just because the pressure got to them. So it's something that could be very, very challenging. And a lot of us, the way the structure of the medical schools are, you have to travel away from home. Most of us actually, if your parents don't reside where the medical school is located, that will probably be your first time going away from home and, being on your own and making new friends, new acquaintances, and sort of figuring things out on your own. So that could be very challenging when you're thinking of people leaving high school at the age of 15, 16, 17, and then just like that, away from the protective environment of the family. Mm-hmm. Now, if you compare that to, the system here in the US, I believe that by the time people go through high school and their initial college education and then come to medical school, you are definitely a lot more mature than what it would be if you were just going straight from high school to medical school. One could look at that and say, well, do you actually need that 4 years to prepare yourself to go to medical school? Could you come back and make it more efficient? I don't necessarily know that we're going to have a right or wrong answer there. I think that will work for some people and it may not work for others if you cut back the number of years that you spend prior to going to medical school proper. But there is something to be said for that. And I know that even in places like Nigeria, there is now consideration for not allowing people to go straight from high school to medical school, but having them go through initial college education, get a bachelor's degree in something first, and then apply before they start their medical training.
I wanted to ask about early on, you worked as a family practitioner in Nigeria. How was that? And did you see that at the time as just a stop along the way, or was that something you were planning to do as a long-time vocation before something changed?
Yeah, so that was actually more of a stopgap measure. There was a period of about 2 years where I did that. One was part of the national service. So, unlike here, where you cannot start practicing until you're done with your residency training, at least in most jurisdictions, I know now that in some rural areas, they allow people to start practicing with maybe limited number of years of residency training because of challenging finding physicians in the rural area. So in Nigeria, once you're done with your primary medical training, you actually get licensed to practice. And to get into a residency program is a lot more challenging. So you have a lot more people graduating from medical school and not enough residency training spots. So unlike here where that ratio is probably like maybe 9 to 10, in Nigeria it's probably something like 2 to 10, two residency slots for 10 graduates.
Wow.
So what you then find is that there's always a waiting period for you to get into a residency training program. So for me, during that time after my national service, while I was waiting to get into a residency training program, I started working as a general practitioner. So that is the typical flow of events in Nigeria. That wasn't a long-term plan for me. I've always had the vision of being an academic physician. So being in general practice or private practice had never been something that was particularly appealing to me. So that was more of a stopgap measure until I could get a residency training slot.
And you subsequently did pathology for several years. Was that something that you were planning to do long term and then changed your view on, or was that something that you were doing as a course of training along the way with the thought of doing something else as a long-term vision?
So when I was in medical school, pathology was actually my best subject. I got some award because of my performance in pathology and all whatnot. So I'd always thought about pathology as one option of branch of medicine that I could see myself practice. And the other area that I thought of as a medical student was obstetrics and gynecology. But I quickly disabused myself of that notion as an intern when I realized that even as an attending gynecologist, you still have to wake up in the middle of the night to come and deliver the baby. I said, no, I'm not doing this.
Yeah.
I can understand doing it as a resident, but if I have to be doing this as an attending, I'm not doing that.
Well, I think that's prescient, yes, because I think that many people who do OBGYN decide around 35, 40 or something that the novelty wore off. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I sort of settled on either I do internal medicine and practice as an internist or I would do pathology. So during that time when I was looking for residency slots, so unlike similar to what we go through in the US, you can apply to different institutions and different programs. So I applied to the one advantage of the pathology application then was you did not have to do a separate entrance exam to qualify to apply. Whereas for internal medicine, you have to first do what we call primary exam that you have to pass before you can even apply for a training program. So I sort of didn't want to go through that primary exam again. I just applied to pathology and then started my residency in pathology. And, I was settled on that. I was happy doing it. And I saw that as a true career choice for me until when I left Nigeria to go to Germany on a scholarship, which is meant to allow you to deepen your knowledge of whatever your postgraduate training is about. So I went to University of Düsseldorf.
Yeah. So can I ask about that? I was wondering both about what led you in your training decide that you wanted or needed a PhD along the way, and then why Düsseldorf from Nigeria? It seems like, other than Antarctica, I just wouldn't envision that as, it's not a logical connection, but maybe I'm missing something.
That is true. So the way the 1 year abroad program is set up is that the trainee has to find the slots on their own. They have to secure the funding on their own, and then they can go once they have those two things sorted out. So what you then see people do is people will apply widely to different institutions all around the world. It doesn't matter where you go. There is no prescription as to this is where you have to go or not. Majority of people will go to the UK because of the, historical relationship and the lack of language barrier. But you still have to apply and then find somebody who is willing to host you and then organize the funding to support yourself while you were there. So I applied with the help of a friend of mine who at that time was studying in Düsseldorf. So I applied to that university and then also applied for a German scholarship to support my stay there. So that was how I ended up going to Germany because the university was willing to host me and then I was successful with the scholarship application that I competed for.
And the PhD?
Yeah, so as you know, in Europe, when people finish medical school, there is the opportunity for you to stay on and spend 2 extra years, similar to the MD PhD program that we have in the States, such that you can build upon your original medical training by spending additional 2 years in the lab. And then that would qualify you to be awarded a PhD degree. So I went there with just the primary interest of doing clinical training in pathology, in anatomic pathology. But then when I landed, I realized that during that period of time, if I want to spend additional time and do dedicated basic research in the lab, I could actually, at the end, be eligible for a PhD degree. So that was what I did. So I landed and learned German for about 4 months at the Goethe Institute. And then once I got to my institute, I spoke to my institute director. And, in Europe, a lot of things depend on what the department chair wants. It's not so much the school, but the department chair that will make that decision of you can do it or you cannot do it. And then it gets submitted to the school. So that was what I did. Once I landed, I started with a project in the lab. And, these days we talk a lot about heterogeneity in cancer and stuff like that. That was actually what I did my PhD in. I did heterogeneity in Barrett adenocarcinoma of the esophagus. So there was a recent paper like 2-3 years ago published, I believe, in the New England Journal where people took different tumors from different sites of the same patient and tried to look at their genomic profile. That was actually what I did when I did my PhD 20 years ago, where we microdissected different portions of the same tumor resected from a patient. And then what one would consider very crude technology these days, just using basic PCR reaction to amplify different genes and see what is different between one region of the tumor and the other. And so that was published. That was like 20 years ago, before we even started talking about, tumor heterogeneity that we all now recognize to be very important. So that was what I did my PhD in when I was there.
What was it like being a Nigerian? This was probably the first time you were anywhere like this far from home.
Yeah.
In another culture, a very different country, learning to speak German. I don't know how welcoming it was, but it seems like a lot for still a young adult to undertake. How did you find that experience?
I think it was a challenge, but a positive challenge, I would say, overall. Throughout my stay in Germany, I did not encounter any hostile reaction of any sort, at least not overt hostility in the general society. Learning the language, there was actually a very well-designed program. That is because they recognize that you're coming from outside, you don't speak the language. So the Goethe Institute actually does a very good job of putting you through the steps. So we spent 4 months where the only thing we were doing was just learning to speak German. And, at the end of that 4-month period, if you have the flair for language, you'll probably be able to speak passable German. And then by the time you get to your institution, and the good thing is we were all at that time coming from different parts of the world under the same scholarship. And I remember then I actually had one of my mates in that German course was a full professor from the US along with his wife, who also came to Germany for that type of exchange program and had to go through that training and everything else. We have people from India, from Indonesia, from Algeria, from the US. The only area that I can't remember if there was any was probably Latin America. But you see people from Africa, from Asia, from North America, all in the same mix. Nobody spoke German, so we all had to figure it out. And it was a very interesting experience. That was my first time outside Nigeria, my first time in Europe, first time I saw snow. But, in life, you meet people that if you just stay where you were, you would never imagine the type of hospitality that you can enjoy when you go to foreign places. One of the best people I've ever met in my life was actually one of the attending I worked with when I was in Germany, Herr Braunstein. He basically took me up like his brother. I will never forget, he went and said, "Oh, you're from Nigeria. You don't have anyone here." On weekends, he will come pick me. We'll go to his house. We'll have dinner together. On Saturday, Sunday, we'll drive across Europe to Netherlands. We'll go to auction house. So he basically picked me up as if I'm like a lost family member that he's been looking for all these years. So I will never forget that experience. And the same thing in the institute where I worked, people were generally friendly. I may be wrong. When I was there, I had the feeling that perhaps because of all the historical problems with the Holocaust and everything else, that the Germans actually went out of their way to let people know that they can be very hospitable and welcoming. At least that was the sense I got, because I thought, they actually make effort to say, whatever happened in the past is not who we are. This is actually what we are, and this is what we're about. You could see that come out, at least in the western part of the country where I was. It might be different in other parts, but, I was in Düsseldorf.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
So when you went there, were you thinking you were going to come back to Nigeria? Obviously, from Germany, you ended up coming to the US. So what was your life plan for where you'd end up? Or did you not have one and just wanted to see what happens?
So it's one of those things. It's like life is what happens when you are planning for something else, right? So at the end of my training, they have what is called the returnees training. So as part of the scholarship that I went under, they actually want to make you successful when you go back home. So they have this 1-week seminar, which is going to teach you about time management, business acumen, and what we consider to be sort of leadership training. So I went for that training. That was like 2 months to the end of my stay in Germany. And as part of that, we had this lecture, and the lecturer came in and he said, "I'm going to say a lot of things today, but you may not remember anything I say, and most likely you will not. But remember one thing, when you get back home, because as part of that, we're all expected to come up with our plans of what are you going to do when you get back home? How are you going to use all this knowledge you've acquired and things like that?" So he said, "Remember when you get back home, you've all presented great ideas and your plans are solid, but it doesn't mean that a solid plan will result in success." So he said, "Remember the Chinese adage. It says a rabbit hole has at least 2 exits." So he said, where am I going there is that no matter how sound you think your plan is, always have an alternative plan. And to be candid, that is probably the only thing I remember from that lecture till today. So how did that then affect my life? So the deal is, I was writing my thesis and I was spending most of my time in the library then. Internet was just still in the infancy. You still have to go into the library, bring out the journals and, physical print and read and do all of that, make photocopies. And so I was doing all of that in the library from morning till night. The only break I had was to go for this training in preparation for going back to Nigeria. And there was this advert on the wall in the library. I've been looking at this for like 3 months when I've been going to the library to write my thesis. And it keeps saying postdoc wanted, Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, US. I've been seeing that and I'm like, what's my own deal with the US? I'm not going there. So I've been seeing that advert for months. I didn't do anything about it. So I went for that training. I came back. And then I remember what that guy told me, that no matter how good your plan is, that you think your plan is, always have an alternative. So I'm like, what have I got to lose here? So there was an email on that advert in the live. So I just took the email, went back to my room, and they said, send your CV or whatever if you're interested. So in a very lackadaisical manner, I just went and took the first page of my CV, I scanned it and sent it. Just like, I just want to have an alternative plan. Not really serious about it. And within like 2 hours, because of the time difference, because that was towards the end of the day, but it was actually like early morning here in the US. Within like 2 hours, I got a response back saying, oh, sorry, only one page of your CV came through. Can you send the old CV? I'm like, what? What just happened? So I sent the old CV, and within a week, I had a postdoc position in the US.
We'll continue our discussion with Dr. Taofeek Owonikoko in the next episode. Thanks for listening. The West Wind Podcast is a Beacon Medical Interchange production with sound engineering and distribution by Mark Lindsay of Talking Speaker. We hope you'll be motivated to subscribe, whether at BeaconMedIC.com, through iTunes, or through another podcast service. Please also rate it, and I hope you'll be inclined to tell friends and colleagues in real life and on social media. We're always happy to get your suggestions and other input at westwindpodcast@gmail.com. Talk to you again soon.